it's an absolute pleasure, obviously, to have Scotland's Makar here with us today, Pàdraig MacAoidh, and Pàdraig is also one of the poets who's part of the Poetry Jukebox, and our Poetry Jukebox is on the ground floor. So there'll be poetry here, and if you'd like to hear more poetry, go down to the ground floor and press the button, and there'll be more poetry. But as I say, today, for this event, we're here to focus on Pàdraig MacAoidh, Scotland's Makar. And Pàdraig MacAoidh is a poet, a lecturer and broadcaster. He has 2 collections of poems. I am not going to try the Scots Gaelic, actually, although I'm really tempted to, but Some Kind of and Galore, both published by Makar, and a pamphlet from another island with Clúthar Press. And Pàdraig is a native Gaelic speaker from the Isle of Lewis. Alongside the poetry, he has co-edited a range of anthologies, including 500 Years of Gaelic Love and Transgressive Verse with Ian Macpherson, 100 Favourite Gaelic Poems, and the Golden Treasury of Scottish Verse with Don Patterson and Kathleen Jamie. And so he's an anthologist and a poet. He's also an academic, and he has written on Heeney's Wordsworth and Sorley MacLean, and he is a senior lecturer in the School of English at the University of St Andrews, and has been an AHRC Radio 3 New Generation thinker. He is the 5th person to hold the Scots Makar role since it was established in 2004, and he is the first Scots Gaelic speaker. And as I say, it's just an absolute pleasure to have him here. He's talking about his role as the Scots Makar, about his poetry. He is no stranger to this island. He was based at the Seamus Heaney Centre up at Queen's, and he did a PhD at Trinity College in Dublin. So this is familiar and known territory for him. And he's talking today with Róise Ní Bhaoill, who's originally from Ranafast in the Donegal Gaeltacht, and is a sort of regular in the library here, and she is an outstanding writer in her own right, both as a short story writer and as a poet. And she has a new collection that is launching next week called Dorden. Hummingbird. That's a new word for me. I'm learning Irish, so that's a new word for me. I did know the word for bird, but not hummingbird. And she has also written extensively on language and cultural issues, and on Irish folklore and mythology. So this is a terrific pairing, and I am so looking forward to the conversation. Thank you very much.
I think we may as well start at the beginning, and if you can take us back to the Isle of Lewis of your youth, and tell us a bit about how that community shaped you as a writer.
Thanks so much, it's great to be here. So from the Isle of Lewis, quite a few of you in the room might know, if you might not, it's actually the 3rd biggest landmass in this archipelago after the one over there and the one we're sat on, bigger than the Isle of Man, but there's only 23,000 people there, and so there's space. And it was fantastic. I grew up in a village of 200 people, many of whom I was related to, many of whom I didn't really want to talk to because I was related to, and so you could always run away to the moor behind you. So I grew up with moor, with sea, with huge night skies of stars, with incredible wind, because it was on the Atlantic coast, and so there was no tree that stood upright. And so describing the natural world there is very much describing the effect of the elements. And so it was a great place to grow up. It was also culturally very rich, and so there were singers, short story writers, poets in the village, in the next village along. It was something that was okay to do. because nobody was ever going to make a living out of it, nobody was going to make a fortune, everybody did it. And so it was more of an actual folk community. And despite being a Gaelic island, it was of course extremely Protestant. It was where Ian Paisley went on his holidays, famously.
And did having that, those poets and the community poetry around you, in a sense, sort of give you the confidence to become a Gaelic writer, or did it sort of grant you permission in a sense?
It meant it was always a possibility. So my great-granduncle, who I'd never met, was a poet. He was a village poet. Wrote a great collection of songs about unrequited love, and then moved to Niagara Falls. My aunt was a singer. My teacher in school was a short story writer, so there was permission there. But weirdly, it was only when I was living in Dublin and then working in Belfast that I started writing in any way seriously. Because certainly in Glasgow at the time there wasn't quite the same encouragement, whereas in both Dublin and Belfast there was.
Yes, there's a big change now.
A big change, and there were just the expectation that you could do something and do it seriously and do it well. And so I was really lucky that when I was in the Seamus Heaney Centre I was working with people like Paul Makar, with Kieran Carson, Sinead Morrissey, Niamh McGunchy and Leon Shafferin, fantastic poets. And so that just makes you...
Raises the standard.
you have to be better than you thought you were.
Yes. I was struck by that poem of yours, Nàdur, or The Well, which I suppose speaks to issues of loss and reclamation, and also in a sense to the refashioning or repurposing of Gaelic for your own practice. You've spoken of your wariness of this repeated return to the source or the well, and maybe at the heart of that wariness is perhaps a concern for the lack of renewal or danger of calcification. Do you think speakers of minoritized languages are condemned to a ritual of interrogating their relationship with loss?
Scottish writers is the poet and short story writer Ian Crichton-Smith, who wrote in Gaelic and in English, and the first things he ever published were fake obituaries in the local newspaper. You invent the deaths around you to get over the fact of cultural death. So this is in Topper. Bimechlik achwag in Topper eror evada ach garirruch in the aun. Sa akin ruch on French Scotch is nice spatchroch wachen. Jamarch chach communiste Lego as brieken. Steelings corduroy. Walked in his far in Toledo, pat the fast natural each in Garwail. Geen langer Jalaskahan of Hemis Nuer and rast in the Morchik Snur. Skivach Times na Voy, a Hagan Ishik Coin, Gach Trip, Amiga Harish. I return each day to the well on the edge of the village, but it's not really there. And I have to rebuild it from the scraps of driftwood and ice, the rubble of life scattered around. Tuesday it is a mix of Lego and lies, jam and corduroy. Another time it's Toledo steel pottery skells, the names of tools oak feathers. No reflection flickers in the fetid darks, the moor-stained currents of the land, but a story that tells me squint each time I start to repeat it.
Thank you. What was another issue that's linked to that issue of loss is this idea of memory, and I know that you're interested in that issue of memory, how reliable it is, and I'm thinking in particular of your poem Anchima, or the tin, and I think you've touched on it as well in your poem, if you got this far. So can languages be trustworthy storehouses of memory?
No, because that's not how memory works. Unfortunately, memory is something that we make up as we go along, and so I'm about to be academic here, or I could dress be an academic. I've got an academic paper on the use of memory in the work of Seamus Heaney, if you want to read that online, and I talk a bit in my book. It's the idea that memory is not a bog body. It's not something that you can just dig up from the ground and it returns intact. It's something that we are inventing as we go. So it's more like the image is a road crew filling in potholes, but never quite ever filling in the road completely. And so when we try and recover a culture, there's always going to be gaps, there's going to be absences, and we have to use imagination to fill in those gaps. Is anybody in the room an archaeologist? No, okay, that's great. I love archaeologists because they tell huge lies. Because they'll have about 5 to 8% evidence, and then they'll go, oh, okay, let's imagine this whole house around us. So I spent some time on digs in Crete, and it was great. You were working from the smallest pottery skelf and trying to imagine the vase. And that's how memory works. It is that full...
Trying to tell the best story.
Trying to do the best story.
Yeah.
And so this poem, and I'll read in a second. How many of you, when you were in primary school, were given a tobacco tin? Is this just a Scottish thing? Can't see. Because everybody in my primary school was given a wee metal tobacco tin. Mine was gold in Virginia. And each day you would you'd be learning new words, and the teacher would write the words out for you and put them in the tin, and you'd take them home, and you'd have to remember them. You'd have to remember the spelling of them. And my mother found this tin. Okay, this is brilliant. I will find out the deep, complex words that lie at the root of my soul and my personality, the words I've forgotten. She opened it and it was dog, cat, phone. And tin. Dyrfamis o fy ysgol, hwyr mi tynnu llefyn tanne, ffarn cyrrin macl yn sgrif drwy sgoldi'n paper. Chwain yr cain ac yn yr un o'ch achos rwy dres fa ysgolygyn anamr yn ysgniefr yn y flaen, y machas mae'r bratan o'r lian. I'r gofalodd lachan, ysnaf gwsir I gydach I chaelj, nam chiawn hantynnu yr myrygych, sgachid ysglyg yn fristig sailj. And this is a translation by Kieran Carson. Very few people translate my work into English. Very few do I let translate my work into English. But Kieran did better than I could, unsurprisingly. When I was in primary school, I got this thin wall of tin where I'd stashed my words, writ on splinters of paper. I can't remember the design, but how difficult it was to open without names and deeds leaping out like salmon from a net. The dumb babble of my languages swimming forever towards their lost ground. The tin in my head rusted, not to be opened, without breaking its crust of salt.
You mentioned that issue of translation there, and I suppose this is something that you may have to negotiate of necessity or by choice. And I know that there are quite a few different viewpoints on that within the Irish language community. As we know, Biddy Jenkinson doesn't permit her poetry to be translated into the English language in Ireland. And then poets such as Cathal Sharkey don't like to translate their own poetry because they feel that, you know, the idea of the English version may be consciously or subconsciously there as they're writing, and they might think, oh, that phrase will be too difficult to translate. And there's probably more of a movement now towards among the young generation of poets in Ireland towards the idea that you publish your first collection in Irish, and then that a bilingual collection will appear down the line. And certainly it could be argued that for poets like O'Sharkey and Ní Bhaoill, their bilingual editions of poetry are really what has made them sort of international poets, particularly in the case of Ní Bhaoill. So how do you as a poet negotiate that, or what is the general stance on that among Gaelic poets in Scotland?
It's slightly different in Scotland for a couple of reasons. If I only published in Gaelic, I can name the 8 to 10 people who would read the books. I have to say. And my work's not easy. I don't understand it that often as well. So they will read it and go, what is this? I'm also bilingual. I've been bilingual since my earliest memories. And so for me to draw a firm line in the sand between Gaelic and English doesn't really make sense. Sometimes I want to express myself in English, sometimes in Gaelic, and I will usually translate across to see if it works. It doesn't always work. Translating a sestina from one language to the other is an absolute nightmare, say. Where you have anything with a formal rhyme scheme, it's almost impossible. But this means to have a readership in Scotland, you do almost always have to translate yourself as well. The one exception would be Niall Gallagher, who published in Gaelic only and had translations by myself, Deborah Moffat, other people, but he has a bilingual collection there as well, selected along the Irish model. But we don't have the likes of Paul Muldoon sitting out there waiting to translate Róise Ní Bhaoill and just send the poems straight from the post. It has to be done a little bit more, either in-house, doing it yourself, or a bit more constructed than that.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Muldoon there, because I think some of the younger academics are looking at Muldoon now and sort of asking the question, because Muldoon generally has translated Nuala's poetry quite loosely, and people, I suppose within the Irish language community, are sort of asking the question, are they really studying Róise Ní Bhaoill's poetry, or are they studying Muldoon's? But I suppose that's another issue. It's always a version, isn't it?
It's the nature of translation.
Yes,
you
exactly.
are studying something different.
So sticking with the idea of language, you, as you said, work in both languages. And a line from one of your poems, I think it is The Last Great Log, comes to mind, that idea of the frontiersman with one foot on one log and one on the other. And I was thinking of the Gaelic tradition and its heritage, and the fact that in that tradition, I suppose, the language is very much associated with the land and the sea, and probably in the instance of the Hebridean tradition, that you're also getting a lot of imagery from the Bible and language from the Bible. So in some senses, I mean, is there an onus on Gaelic poets to be true to that tradition, or how do you, as a contemporary poet, sort of grapple with that tradition and make it your own?
Really interesting question, partly because the linguistic resources we have in Gaelic are based on agriculture, the sea, the Bible. These are the images that we have been given for the last couple of 100 years, or the last 1,000 years. But we can't be limited by that. And so I worked at the BBC for 2.5 years, off and on, as a broadcast journalist and a news producer. And if you're doing a story about the war in Syria, all of a sudden you have to just make things up. You have to. You are talking on air, and you're going to have to be able to talk about a conflict and images and ideas that have not been used in that language before. And it's fantastic, because you get to see on a daily basis, if you listen to all of the Gaelic news programmes, whoever's on first thing in the morning gets to invent the phrase to talk about this topic. AI, artificial intelligence, whatever it's going to be. COVID was great because this whole vast range of vocabulary that had to be created in the language, in linguistic terms. But then you can see that through the day there's an argument happening between the different journalists. We've got, oh, I didn't like that phrase. And so they introduce another one, and over 2 or 3 days it will get formalised and firmed up. But you get to see the language evolving in front of you. And that's a fascinating and really creative process to be part of.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. There's quite a bit of debate in Ireland about translation and about, I suppose, we talk a lot about tradition and whether a poet is within the tradition, or whether they're fashioning it in their own image. Moving on slightly now, and it's something that Patsy mentioned there in your bio. You've written about Sorley MacLean, or Sorley MacLean. And I remember encountering MacLean the first time, obviously at university. At a time when I was reading Irish Gaelic poets who were largely focused, it has to be said, on the backward glance. And MacLean was a real tonic in that obviously he was looking at the local, but he had a much more sort of European and global focus as well. And MacLean has said that Ireland had much more of its heart than any other country other than Scotland. And I suppose he was keen on healing that historic rupture between the literary world of Ireland and Scotland. What do you think his legacy is, and does it endure to this day? Is there a relationship between Scottish Gaelic poets and Irish poets now?
So Sir William MacLean, when he first published his work in the 1930s and 1940s, was told he was not traditional. He was told this is not poetry at all, this is not Gaelic poetry. And so I think every single generation you have these issues of the tradition is absolutely rewritten and done anew. His brother Callum lived in Galway and converted to Catholicism there. His first love was Nessa Nishi from Dublin, so he had lots of strong personal connections to Ireland as well. But he also had a sense of himself of an ethnic connection as well as a cultural one. He did believe in the Gael with capital G, this blood that was shared between Ireland and Scotland. Some people still hold that, and that does take you into complicated territory. But I think what developed from the 70s onwards was a really strong sharing of poetry, music, song between Ireland and Scotland through the Bardic Circuit that happened every year, where Irish poets would go to Scotland, Scottish poets would come back over, and this stopped in 2014. And there's been a gap there. And so for a slightly older generation, there was this sense of real clear connection between the language communities. Now, Alfred McGarvey in Cork wants to resurrect this next year and asked me to help, so we're going to try and do something with the Bardic Circuit again. And maybe with some Scots in there as well.
Yes.
So both Scots and Ulster Scots, I'd like to see to have that bridge there too, partly because then we can ask for different sorts of pots of money.
That's always useful. Looking at an Ulster poet that went in the other direction and spent some time in the Hebrides in the 1930s, and of course that was Louis MacNeice. And the publication that resulted from that trip was called I Crossed the Minch, which has variously been described as interesting, eccentric and possibly slightly mad. I believe that one of your poems, Ag Fagad Vratin, Leaving Britain, is a kind of response to MacNeice's Leaving Barra. But for the moment I'm interested in MacNeice's attitudes to the local communities, that sort of, I suppose, combination of seduction and disappointment, the lauding of the pure Celts and the language and the communal living, and on the other hand, I suppose, disappointment and almost disdain at the perceived backwardness of the community and the poverty he saw there. And I suppose his personal disappointment that the Gael in him hadn't been drawn to the surface by the magnetism of his fellows, as he put it himself. So as you know, these attitudes are to language communities, and we have similar attitudes in Ireland, are remarkably enduring. And I think in particular of those attitudes to the Hebridean Gael as a sort of straight-backed, tight-lipped, sort of the prim, grim Gael sort of character. And I know that you, with Ian Macapherson, have edited, as Patsy mentioned, and your Leah, the light blue book, 500 Years of Gaelic Love and Transgressive Verse. And I'm sure that that challenges some of those notions.
It does. A couple of different things there. So when I was in Belfast, I was working on a modern Irish and Scottish poetry project with Edna Longley and Fran Bearden. And we were largely looking at crossing back and forth between Scotland and Ireland, those connections. And it was a romp. It was great fun, partly because the two countries were sites of desire for the other poets. Irish poets would go to Scotland and have this fantastical version of Scotland that they would try and fulfill, and vice versa. Scottish poets would come and have these mad versions of Ireland that they would try and find. And Louis MacAoidh's is one of the maddest. It's great because he goes and he's in a hotel in Harris and has a conversation between his 2 feet that he does in verse. He gets bored 2/3 of the way through it, so he just starts writing in different genre, and there's a noir element to it. Honestly, if you can read it and it's out of print, it is out of print, so try and get a copy, it's hilarious. But one of the things myself and Ian McPherson, who lives in Belfast, just beside Methody, did with our book was to try and take some of the more romanticised, short print versions of the Highlands and just ridicule them, or just point out that this was not the history that we had. And so from the 19th century onward, there was this version of the Scottish Highlands that was backward, prim, and strangely desexualised. Whereas anybody who knows anything about Scottish Gaelic and Irish material of between the 13th and 18th centuries is, it's raucous, it's rude, it's bawdy, it's messy, it covers every topic under the sun, it pulls no punches with its vocabulary. It is as direct as you want. If you want a poem about gonorrhea, tick. If you want a poem that's warning you about the old men in Arnamurchan because of their habits, tick, you have that. If you want poems in praise of body parts, oh yes, we have many of them.
It reminds me of the lexicographer Nicholas Williams talking about actually going to my area in Manifest and sitting in the kitchen talking to 2 women about the 90 words they had about the male member. So people just thought differently at the time. The Victorians do have a lot to answer for.
And the difficulty is when you come to translating these poems, you have to choose between all of the English words for the male member to try and fit the correct tone. Which of the words end in ICK you choose, or do you go end in OCK? And it's great fun, but it's very difficult to match it precisely onto the Gaelic and its sensibilities. Do you want one?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the oldest poem in our book, which is a poem by Ishba Ní Bhaoill, the daughter of the Countess of Argyll. And she really liked the family's priest. Éisteh flucan taise. Éisteh flucan taise riscéirih na bot bríomhór, the hound the machríos a cuit the scéirih the scríomh. Gilíon for bot bravloch the vase and amse roin, tak fernord cravishe bot the chafat roin. Bot ma hackers toeristel, gitaach a flatter shesloch, och a gan and cool of an revet aan de waken. A ta rever o raver a shin is nie scale breke, noch a chool of a raver of what irish is Éisteh. Listen, everyone in the house, to the tales that have been written of the energetic cocks with which my heart is smitten. Forget the death-dealing cocks so plentiful in the past. This man of holy orders has a cock helmet at least as vast. Though the dick of my salaried priest is enduring and long, ach, have ye heard about the stoutness of his dong? It is so mightily thick, I promise these aren't lies. Since Fergus, there's been no cock anywhere near as wide. Listen. So is this being recorded? My mother hates it when I do this and I can't pass it on, sorry.
Okay, moving swiftly on. I visited Lewis, it's many years ago now, and one of the things I was struck by really were the similarities between the island and my own Gaeltacht community in West Donegal in terms of the landscape, and it has to be said, a horizontal rain, and but also the lived experience of the people. And I remember having a conversation there with a man who had worked all over the world in far-flung places that your average working class man in Glasgow or Edinburgh could only dream of. So I suppose leaving has always been a part of the story. And we mentioned your poem earlier when we were talking about like Níos Fágal, Rathin leaving Britain. And I think that speaks to that issue, but I imagine to wider issues as well.
Yes, and so there's a great website that is the Scottish Island News, run by a woman called Rhoda Meek. And at the end of it, it's a newsletter each week, and at the end of it she does news stories exoticising Scotland, how remote they are, how far away from civilization they are, undiscovered beaches that everybody knows exist because they've been in the New York Times. But they are among the least remote places I've ever been, because in a village of 200 people, you know that person has sailed around the world, they've taken a boat through the Suez Canal, she worked in service in London, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, in Dublin, and you have all of these stories because the sea connects you rather than separating you. But there is always this idea that everybody does have to leave at some point. You do have to leave for work. It's very, very hard to stay there all of your life. And some go back, and some don't. So the trope of leaving, whether it's leaving Barra or leaving Britain, is always there. I was a BBC journalist. You very rarely talk publicly about politics after that. They drill it into you, the sense, and this is probably a poem about leaving Great Britain in 2014-15, rather than just about getting on the ferry to the Isle of Lewis. So this is a quietly Scottish independence poem. Ashil review faglan ilan sydd rai, fad ar ben. Yn bath y siŵl y machaloch bryn, the pelican mar I chain ysgedachig ishkin y stŵr. Chynnu archus y fawn y stŵr sy'n o'n charach sy'n crechoch the dŵr fach carn coci na hyr ac ysyn shapely, yn letyn na hyr chestion yn agos gyda sé ashling a hawn, sobe sé yn y tyn o'ch trochat yn ffiugu, a change a cholanach yn ysgwrs yn falaf sgir yn inefich. Na calm yn y pich gyda'r Alanya. Hagach fach colonish cho tríd hylir y Alanya, ach chanil sin a gran ach gyrid ffyr a graegus, chanil taxir I ein sy'n gyr na sgilin, sgil ach rwydd na or an ŵr. Fat ar behen, y fehu orhir ŵr, crwbacyn na falach ans y far och ŵr ein yn ror jys contrais ar siach glisglin, a chanil sy'n chai. It's really hard to switch between languages because they require entirely different shapes of your mouth, especially for the vowel sounds. And so I'm trying to get all of the mistakes into the vowel sounds into the Gaelic. So the Milchal there is listening with a pain deer. So it happens every so often. If you notice my vowel sounds going off, that's just the Gaelic taking over there. Something else happening. Leaving Britain. We've been leaving this island, my love, all our lives. The boat tacking out of Loch Broom, the porpoise like forgetfulness gulled in our wake. We've no regrets propelling us from that rock, the stony insistence of its war memorials, the same simple answers to the same vapid questions. And though this is just a dream, a washy light pouring through wooden slats, it will never come to life in the empty nooks of business districts, pigeons pecking at the glass. Each word is now as see-through as thin glass, but that doesn't mean they are true, my love. And there are no taxis to be got for love or pennies, red tales or resung songs. All our lives waiting on new frontiers, like crabs skulking in cold seaweed. Despite the ebb and flow of our sevenfold excuses, there's no returning to this island. I've never read that poem in public before. It's really good. I have no idea what's going on there. Thank you for choosing it.
I know that earlier today you were involved with other poets who were responding to, as far as I understand, Burns's poems. And I know that you're really interested in the intersection between Gaelic and Scots, be that the syntax or just the borrowing of words from one to the other. So I was really interested in your poem on Búrach, or the Buddha, I suppose, in Scots.
Because I grew up in a Gaelic-speaking area, Scots wasn't that common. It really wasn't, so we had Gaelic and then really quite pristine English is what we spoke, with no Scots apart from the parts of Stornoway. So I've got this, I probably exoticize Scots myself. I probably have this romantic relationship where I go, oh, the sounds are fantastic. Do I get to tick the box in the sense that I'm a Scots speaker though? But I teach bards, I teach Scots language texts, I teach Hugh McDermott now. I know the language quite well, but I also don't claim it as my own. It's something different. But I'm really interested in the words that are shared between Gaelic and Scots, and there aren't that many of them, but they usually tend to be quite telling. And my favourite one is Búrach, which is used in both Scots and Scotland and Gaelic, and it just means mess, chaos, things jumbled up together. Oh, your bedrooms are right, Búrach. And so I took the word Búrach for a walk through a poem, basically more or less imagining it as a creature, and then a creature that evolves. So this is it. Yn Búrach galior céin yn brúntolar, drochis hóris, tropile misc na luchturis was meint in a valle, the fiach drikes a lorok and the at the rifhaiv, and itch in Charum Búrach a rief brian on the hall. O hen ha mi uamnachach a rifi pars an Búrach, mir a gof uamnachach in ye corra Búrich an sin. A change a good card clav agus fuamerk na strucht na leintje mar isketron grinner filot a hurricanes when she is a get in the bar. Vich na shemisich Búrach tronaicus a vabasho ach inis han jordan nashente a tashpin a Búrich de jolish a hand of rain. Nach teach at a cheangach haast. Déjà vu agus cawl. Lavens glútoch I an a Búrach de Gimlin Green. Iag sin duich gaif agus rhaid o Búrach ie. Jo, iag sin Búrach gaif agus rhaid duich ie. Ienach na rom na fuse Búrach agus herkid forstrasach, dein jiffer go fat sa haar Búrach galior Makar agus cheva galior. Hier yn biawns yn Búrachan, gos yn bys yn biawn Búrach yn rhysg, slanch. Nach can eisiau Búrach bach byddoch y tein ac yn doros. The Búrach is mumbling its way along George IV Bridge, trying to weave its way through the tourists and the locals, a way that will block out the they find difficult to pronounce, never mind the itch and all those ach the Búrach was never spoken here. Mispronunciation has long been a feature of the Búrach's life, but even if it is unspeakable, is that the Búrach's problem? Not everything is fully digested when vowels ooze through centuries, like rain through a grit of consonants, nuanced rhyme to the cowgate. The Jacobites would have Búrach through the night in this city, but now the National Library displays the Búrach of knowledge that sits untranslated inside, a feeling of déjà vu, of forgotten resonance, spidery hands lolloping all over the elegant margins. We left you a country and you made a Búrach of it. Or we left you a Búrach and you made a country of it. Even the Romans would make a Búrach and call it peace. But what does it matter as long as there's Búrach enough left over for a wee dram? Slanjava, land of hills and Búrachs, land me your Búrach reek, Búnroch no way out.
It's interesting that you talk about sort of your relationship, or maybe the lack of relationship, with Scots as you were sort of growing up, or as a Gaelic speaker. I mean, for West Donegal Irish speakers, it's interesting that certainly in the past, because of the migration, that people from West Donegal would go to areas such as Donegal town to learn the Scots, so that they could speak it when they went to Scotland. Not all of the group would speak it, but just the ganger, as he was called, would learn to speak Scots. So in the Irish of Donegal, there are actually quite a lot of Scots words, and they've been there for so long that people are not actually aware that there are Scots words. How are we doing for time? I actually... 1:15. Okay. So I suppose it's coming to that point where I'm going to wrap it up, and so that the audience can ask you some questions here. But you are now the Makar.
Am I?
The national poet of Scotland, and the first Gaelic national poet of Scotland. So how has it been up until now, and what are your plans for the rest of the term?
It's really interesting as a process. If you ever get the opportunity to be the national poet of a small to medium-sized European country, I recommend you take it. Don't go for a big one. Don't go for one with its own active monarchy. And so, luckily Simon Armitage has to deal with anything to do with the monarchy. I just have to deal with more local matters. It's a privilege, a job, an honour. It's an odd thing. And so, partly it's something that I think it's really important to actually turn into a process of making, because the word Makar comes just from the maker. So my job is to write 3 or 4 poems a year. My job is to encourage other people, especially young people, to read and to write poetry. And so it means I spend lots of time getting 8-year-olds to tell me stories, which is a fantastic way to escape from the world and into other ones. And so there are things that I've been really lucky and really privileged to do because of that. And because I'm the first Gaelic speaker as well, there is this odd sense of representation, which is not something I really like or are not comfortable with, because I know just how diverse and distinct all of the ideas of Gaelic speakers are. Non-Gaelic speakers might think, oh no, they all are the same. And I can't represent all of them, I dislike most of them. Are you recording this, John? But the difficulty is that you can't represent such a diverse group. And it just means that one thing that I said to myself when I took the role in is I would speak Gaelic in rooms that it is not normally spoken in, just as a matter of course, just as this is a language that has a right to be here, and just for everyday life to take place in that language. And that's more or less one of the main ambitions. The other one is to celebrate as many languages in Scotland as possible. And so I've done a series of events in the Edinburgh Book Festival this year, Stanza Festival next year, Edinburgh again next year, where I get poets writing who live in Scotland and write in different languages to respond to each other. So I've had Gaelic, Scots, French, Spanish, Macedonian, Laziale, a version of Italian, and this becomes part of the multilingual conversation that is contemporary Scotland. It's not just English, Gaelic and Scots, though those are really important, but there are lots of other languages there that we can acknowledge and play with and have interesting conversations in.
I'd love if you could finish off with one of the new poems that you've written, Pàdraig MacAoidh.
Yes, and this is a poem that was written after a 13th century Irish poem, O Messenger Who Comes from Rome, which is in Bone and Marrow, Cnavan Swear, that great anthology of Irish language poetry. It might have been written by Gilabreach and Makar, but there is some debate about that. And it's a poem that is celebrating the importance of poets and poetry, despite attacks from the church. It does say that poetry is largely important for genealogy, celebrating heroic deeds, and for emphasising the class divisions that should be maintained in society. So I don't necessarily agree with the thrust of the poem, but I took an image from it. Búil, apple. Gibbe ha bardach lán bríocan, se bríocan maranach uhunta, as chané bríocan shabbatach. Surmid urbse de chur an an bhain, harwa firné agus chavia marach, ach shaul, cho bria sa han briag, cho milish. Although poetry is full of lies, they are lasting ones, not fleeting or fly-by-night ones. You can trust a poem. It wasn't true yesterday. It won't be true tomorrow, but look, how beautiful the lie, how sweet.
One time, Pàdraig MacAoidh.